In this game, Alireza Firouzja carries out one of the great plans of chess, a plan perfected by Jose Raul Capablanca, who created the template for all the players that followed. In fact, I covered a game using this very plan on this channel recently, but today we're going to look at Alireza carrying out the same plan at the Tata Steel tournament in 2024. His opponent is Jordan van Foreest, a very strong grandmaster rated 2682. Alireza has the black pieces. He's rated 2759 in this game. Let us jump right in. Jordan van Foreest begins with e4. Firouzja plays the French defense with e6, d4, d5, knight to c3, the absolute main line for white. And Alireza plays knight to f6, challenging the center with his knight on f6, putting pressure on e4. And here white plays bishop to g5, pinning that knight to the queen. Now, black has three main ways of dealing with this pin. There's bishop to e7, just relieving the pin. There's also bishop to b4, counter pinning, the McCutcheon system, very sharp opening. But instead, Alireza just takes on e4, plays more calm. Knight takes e4, bishop to e7. And here the main line for white these days is to take on f6 with the bishop. But the problem is that black can retake with the pawn, and black gets some pretty decent play here. Moves like f5 together with rook to g8, b6, bishop to b7, with play on the long diagonal hitting g2, etc., etc. So Grandmaster Foreest decides to take a different approach. He takes on f6 with the knight instead, and after bishop f6, queen takes f6. Black seems fine after this, and it's true white doesn't have much of a theoretical advantage here, but Grandmaster Foreest has a very interesting idea and plan he wants to carry out in this position. First, he plays knight to f3, and after castles, he plays queen to d3. And we can see what he's trying to do. He wants to castle long and have opposite side castling and just attack black's king on the king side and have sort of a race, one side versus another. Firouzja plays bishop to d7. The bishop can go to c6, of course, putting pressure on the long diagonal. White plays queen to e3. Basically, he wants to move out of the way so that his light squared bishop can go to d3, its best attacking square, aiming right at h7. So knight to c6 is played by Alireza. The idea, of course, he's putting pressure on d4, but the key idea is after bishop d3, he would play knight to b4, immediately harassing that bishop at d3, keeping it from being comfortable. So white instead castles long, planning again for the sharp position. Rook f to d8. White wants to put as much pressure on d4 as possible because he wants, or black does, he wants white to play c3 to defend this pawn and create some weaknesses around his king, particularly on these light squares. And surprisingly, white does that immediately. He plays c3. He didn't have to. He could just play move like rook to d2, preparing to build up. But instead, he plays c3, which is a novelty. I don't know if it's a great one or not. Basically, he does what black wants him to do. And Alireza plays knight to e7. Now, what he's trying to do is reroute his minor pieces. The knight can go to f5 or d5. The bishop can go to c6. He actually has another interesting location for that bishop, as we will see. White plays queen to e5, seeking the trade of queens. I guess he doesn't trust the kingside attack anymore with the light squared weaknesses around his own king. But Firouzja plays bishop to a4, counterattacking the rook at d1, and he would love for white to play b3, further weakening those pawns, but instead white plays rook to e1, just adding a little more support to his queen. But here Firouzja just says, I don't want to trade queens. He plays queen to g6, and because this bishop is at a4, he's threatening mate on c2. And that forces the further weakening of white's position with b3 to block that bishop, so there is no mate on c2. Now, Firouzja could play bishop to c6, threatening to take on f3, but that would block his c-pawn, and he doesn't want to do that. He wants to use that pawn as part of his applying of pressure to the center. So he retreats the bishop all the way back to e8 so he can advance that c-pawn. Queen to g5 is played, and here black could go ahead and just exchange queens and be okay, but instead he plays the knight to d5, putting pressure on this c3 pawn, and now white goes ahead and exchanges queens. hg6. Now king to b2, defends the pawn at c3. Now rook a to c8. He's continuing his plan that he has wanted to execute here to advance the pawn to c5 and reduce white's control of the central squares. Bishop to c4, and now c5, dc5, and rook to c5. Now we come to the position that Capablanca pioneered the strategy for. Basically, we have a position with mutual pawn majorities. White has a pawn majority on the queen side. Black has a pawn majority on the king side. And what both sides want to do is advance, in Black's case is E and F pawns, and in White's case is B and C pawns, and create a passed pawn and use that pawn to put pressure on the opponent, even threaten to queen. That was the plan that Capablanca perfected. So let's see how that goes. In Capablanca's famous game, where he showed the power of the queen side pawn majority, both kings were on the king side, and he could advance his queen side pawns without having to worry about king safety. In this case, however, both sides have to think about the safety of their kings as they advance their pawns in front of their king, but White's king is actually a little less safe here. White begins with rook to e5, pinning the knight laterally. Firouzja plays a very strong move, b5, gaining space, forcing a decision on d5. And there's another important point behind this move, which we'll see in a second. White takes on d5, rook takes, rook takes, rook takes. And now because this pawn is on b5, when White plays c4, the pawn will be passed, but it will also be isolated. So White does go ahead and play that. Pawn takes, pawn takes. And now this pawn is dangerous. It is a passed pawn, but it's also an isolated pawn, along with the pawn at a2. Firouzja plays a very strong move here. Rook to f5, pinning the knight to the f2 pawn, threatening bishop to c6, which he could double the pawns and win the pawn at f3. White is under a lot of pressure here, and the bishop is quite a bit better than the knight with pawns on both sides of the board. Rook to d1 to activate the rook, maybe play rook to d8, king to f8, rook to d8. And computers, by the way, still think White is okay here, but he has to respond to so many threats. Black could just play king to e7, hitting that rook. It looks fine, but Alireza wants to get on with his plan of advancing his majority, so he plays the pawn to e5 immediately, begins to move those pawns forward. King to b3 is played, a strong idea. Basically, after e4, when the knight moves, Black was going to take on f2 with check. By playing king to b3, taking on f2 is no longer with check, and that allows White to counterattack, as we shall see. e4 was played by Black, but then knight to d2. He counterattacks the pawn at e4, and if rook f2, the knight can take, say rook f2, knight takes e4, rook g2, rook to a8, and with a threat to the a7 pawn, also threats of knight to d6, the position is dynamically equal here. So Firouzja goes ahead and plays king to e7, attacking the rook on d8. The best move is probably, computers say, is rook to d5, just sort of holding things together in the center after king e6, rook to d8, just kind of going back and forth. Rook f2, knight takes e4, and again, we have a dynamically equal position. But here, White sort of goes for it, and they play rook to a8, attacking the a7 pawn, but that gives Black the time he needs to carry out his plan. Firouzja plays bishop to c6. Of course, that hits the rook at a8, but more importantly, it defends the pawn at e4. That's his key idea. Allowing the pawn to be taken on a7 with check, the king moves to d6, and again, the f2 pawn is now threatened. Rook to a6 pins the bishop, and of course threatens to take the pawn, but you can't add any more pressure to the bishop at c6. It just prevents it from defending e4 for the moment, so he steps out of that pin. King goes to c7, rook to a7 check, king to d8, king to c3, and rook takes f2. And he's threatening to take on g2, and it looks like White is in big trouble. Believe it or not, he can still hold from this position, which is a surprise. But knight to b3, e3, and the move White could play that could hold the position here is king to d3, with the idea of e2, then king to d2, controlling the queening square. After bishop g2, knight to d4, piling up on e2, advancing the pawns. And here, White has enough counterplay to save the game. But instead, Jordan Van Foreest plays a move that looks more obvious, really. but is actually a big mistake. He plays the move knight to d4. The knight controls the square, although obviously it's defended by the rook also, but he hits the bishop at c6. But that allows Firouzja to play an incredibly powerful move. I mean, this is just a beautiful, beautiful shot from black. Bishop to e4, exclamation point. He uses the bishop along with the pawn to create a barrier that white's king cannot cross, and he's in big trouble. After c5, the rook goes to d2, and here white actually resigned. And here's the reason. White can do any number of things. I mean, he can advance the c-pawn, he could take on f2, but let's say he plays c6, then all black has to do is play rook takes knight. And that's the issue. King takes rook, and then e2, and there's no way to stop the pawn from queening. A beautiful game from Alireza, really a strategy passed down from generation to generation. And after going over this great game from Firouzja, believe it or not, the next game you're going to want to check out is this game right here, in which I show you where Capablanca pioneered this great plan. Thank you for joining us at Chess Talk. See you again soon. Bye.